Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. Putting America first, second, and third. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show today. It is Wednesday, August 14th, 2013, hump day, middle of the week, middle of the month, actually, starting our long, slow glide down to Pauhana Friday and another relaxing weekend, especially for Barack Obama and much of the Congress who are on their summer recess. And Obama and the family are ensconced over there in Martha's Vineyard, making the vineyarders' lives very uncomfortable and inconvenient. And much of Congress is over there in Israel, getting their obligatory picture taken in front of the Wailing Wall in advance of their running for re-election or for promotion or whatever. We have a lot of stuff to talk about today. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Manny is sitting in our control room, twiddling the dials, keeping us out of trouble, ready to answer the phones when you call on in. Interesting little story. I'm going to take things a little out of sequence from what I normally do. I sort of have a priority list of stories that I cover, and then I work on down, but this one really kind of caught my eye, and it has to do with a story that appeared in the Associated Press, where now that Bradley Manning has had his trial and he's been convicted and he's coming up on his sentencing, and he intends to speak at his sentencing hearing. Probably he's going to say some things the government doesn't want to get out. So they're already starting the smear campaign and the bashing. And apparently they've got an Army psychologist who's come out who said, this guy is really sick. You don't want to listen to this guy. And they're claiming he's got a gender identity problem in a hostile workplace. And that put incredible pressure on him. And he just cracked and went nutso. And this, of course, is happening just 2 days after a petition with 100,000 signatures arrived at the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, urging that Manning be given the 2013 Nobel Peace Prize. So we have a U.S. Army psychic witch doctor, who apparently has never heard of doctor-patient confidentiality, is claiming Manning is a sexually befuddled cross-dresser and no real patriotic American would ever listen to anything he has to say. Now, the national security state is in a panic over this idea that so many people think that Manning should get the Peace Prize. They don't want the people at large to view leakers as heroes. And they want to send a message to other potential leakers. If you tell the world about the crimes of the U.S. government, we will ruin your reputation. We'll absolutely destroy you publicly, and everybody will think you're just a wacko tinfoil hat wearing kook. But you know something? They have played that game so many times, and we recognize it as a tactic right out of the former Soviet Union. Nobody's paying attention. Nobody's going to be paying attention to anybody in a uniform saying anything bad about Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden or anybody else, because we know that's what they do. If the facts are against you, argue the law. If the law is against you, argue the facts. If both the facts and the law are against you, you call the other guy names, and that's exactly what they're doing with Bradley Manning. Right now, the government seems to be dealing with a crisis that some of the people still in their employ do have moral consciences. Whether it's Bradley Manning or Edward Snowden or any of these other whistleblowers and leakers who are coming forward. And the government doesn't know how to deal with that. I'm sure there's a huge DARPA-funded project on how to surgically remove morals and ethics and a conscience from their employees, turn them into these little obedient drones who will do as they're told, drop drone attacks on civilians on the other side of the world and not feel bad about it. I'm sure they're working on something to solve that little embarrassing problem of ruling a population that actually has a moral conscience out there. Now, moving on here, obviously big news over in Egypt. It is looking less and less like Morsi's removal was the will of the Egyptian people and more like it was a staged counter-coup to get rid of the upstart Morsi, who was holding firm against U.S. and Israeli influence, and get another Mubarak light in there. And the new Egyptian interim government, which is getting weaker and weaker because apparently the interim vice president just resigned, but they have declared a month-long state of emergency, meaning it's a crackdown. The Egyptian soldiers are going to go out there and start shooting anybody who doesn't think this new transition is a positive thing for the nation of Egypt. And that basically blows the whole idea that this is a popular change. This is not democracy. This is a coup d'etat. And my guess is it was probably orchestrated and sponsored by the United States government and by Israel, who saw the loss of Mubarak as a major strategic defeat in that part of the world. We know, watching the history of the U.S. and Iran, the attitude is, once we conquer you, you stay conquered, by golly. We're not going to let you go. The U.S. overthrew the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953, oppressed the people, sold Iran's oil for pennies on the dollar, made the oil companies rich, made the Iranian people poor, until finally they got fed up with it in 1979 and kicked out the U.S. puppet, the Shah, and said, we're going to run our own country for a while. And the U.S. said, you can't do that. And they've been trying to find some way back into Iran ever since, including that very aborted attempt at a coup d'etat in 2009, which imploded when the son of the Shah opened his big mouth and started saying, I am ready to resume the peacock throne. And they started handing out these flags of the new Iran, and it was the exact same flag that the Shah had been flying. And at that point, the people of Iran said, oh, no, we're not going back to that. And that whole thing fell apart. So the U.S. is still trying to play the game by the rules that worked back in the 1950s and 1960s. And it's not working as wonderfully as it used to. So apparently Egypt is going to be turned into a bloodbath in order to bring it back under the sway of the Western powers. And a lot of people are getting killed. Apparently 149 dead so far as the Egyptian police storm the protest camps. Now remember, the Egyptian people are not engaging in acts of violence. They're simply out there saying, no, we don't like this new direction. And the new direction is saying, by golly, yes, you will, because it is not a democracy. It's yet another U.S.-sponsored dictatorship. Now remember, since the end of World War II, the United States has justified its direct military interventions, its covert military interventions, its regime change, always on the promise that we're bringing democracy to those poor people. And out of all of those interventions, not one genuine democracy has ever surfaced. It's always been a dictatorship under a puppet ruler for the benefit of American financial interests. All wars are bankers' wars. Now, yesterday we were talking about this little sort of spin and distraction where they're trying to take the focus off of whether the attack on the Benghazi consulate was a botched political stunt for Obama's re-election campaign by pointing out that some 400 surface-to-air missiles were stolen in Benghazi. And the two stories are not mutually exclusive. I'm not saying that that didn't happen. But we're all of a sudden starting to see this trend, very disturbing trend, where the U.S. government is saying that thus and such weapons were stolen here. 400 missiles in Benghazi, 20,000 missiles in Tripoli, 20,000 M16s stolen in Kuwait. And it looks to me like the U.S. is getting ready to try and covertly arm yet another incursion force, and they're covering up the transfer of weapons by saying, oh, golly gee, they were stolen. Because frankly, if the United States government cannot be trusted to keep these weapons secure, at least to the same extent that law-abiding gun owners in this country are expected to, then we've got a major problem. Apparently, there's another story coming out that one of the Air Force units in charge of nuclear weapons just failed their safety and security check. Maybe it's time for the United Nations to come in and take control of America's military, lest it fall into the hands of terrorists. Because it seems like that's where all this stuff is going on. Story out of Investment Watch blog, 98% of all drone strikes do kill civilians. The CIA has gone back to insisting there are no targeted drone strikes, even though Obama himself admitted as much on TV a couple of months ago. And apparently the policy in Washington, D.C. is you're not supposed to remember what the president said a couple of months ago. Only listen to and trust what you're hearing today. We're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And getting back on down to Florida and the very strange murder, because that is what it was, of Ibrahim Todashev. The father is suing the FBI and the authorities for the death of his son. The lawyers are saying that the government has provided absolutely no evidence that Ibrahim Todashev was armed in any way or a threat in any way, at the point where the FBI apparently just hauled off and shot him, including a kill shot into the head. And it looks like the silencing of witnesses or the silencing of uncooperative witnesses who won't go along with signing a coerced confession seems to be right out there in the open for everybody to see. Because the only explanation I can think of that explains the sequence of events is that the FBI was browbeating this guy, trying to get him to make statements that were false, sign a confession that was false, and he refused and finally said, "I'm leaving." And the FBI was faced with the possibility of Todashev going out and being interviewed by the independent media to say, yes, the FBI was trying to force me to say things that are not true, and that's why they had to kill him. And this is not the first time that's happened. Going back and looking at the bombing of the Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, there were numerous people who came forward and said the FBI wasn't asking us what was going on. They were telling us what to say. One of the witnesses that was touted as having identified Timothy McVeigh in an incriminating position only said so after the FBI worked on him for about 2.5 months, and at the end they refused to put him on the stand out of fear that the defense attorneys would simply rip the testimony apart. We also saw that back following the murder of Vincent Foster. The FBI was trying to coerce people into saying things or trick people into saying things that were not true. Case in point, the manufactured testimony of Lisa Foster, identifying the gun shown to her by the FBI as belonging to her husband, when the FBI's own records clearly indicate it wasn't the same gun. And it goes on and on and on. And now the American people are seeing it. Over in Mumbai at their naval base, the Indian Navy has suffered a major disaster. One of their Russian-built submarines has exploded in the harbor. 18 sailors are believed to still be trapped inside. The rest got out. Apparently there was some kind of an onboard fire that also cooked off a couple of torpedoes that damaged some of the other ships there. So hopefully they'll get those guys out. But it's a major embarrassment. These weapon systems really aren't built very well by either country. Although right now the United States, I think, has the gold medal for overly expensive, non-working military hardware, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit later in the show here. Now, there's another story that has come out from Democracy Now!, and it involves Nicholas Merrill, who used to run an internet service provider company called Calix in New York, and he was issued a national security letter. Now, we've been hearing about these going all the way back to the Clinton administration. And the idea is if you're issued a national security letter, you must do what the letter says, and you are forbidden from telling anybody that you got the letter or that what you're doing is being ordered by the government. Now, there are serious questions about whether this is actually legal under the Constitution of the United States of America. There's no oversight, there's no controls. And apparently this Nicholas Merrill went along with the national security letter for 6 years, and finally he just had enough of this, and he went to the American Civil Liberties Union, which has filed the first lawsuit challenging the national security letter, because it represents, first of all, complete dictatorial authority. Do what this letter says, or you'll go to jail and nobody will know where you are, and you can't tell anybody you're doing this for us. That's prior restraint. A gag order basically involves termination of your First Amendment rights to freedom of expression. To stand out there and say, the government is telling me to do this. This is why I am doing this. This is why I am behaving in this way that is contrary to my prior patterns, is because the government told me to and threatened me. If I don't do as I'm told, bad things will happen. And we've been hearing about these national security letters for a very, very long time. And I would agree with the American Civil Liberties Union. There is nothing in the Constitution that authorizes the federal government to go to any citizen and say, you have to do something we want you to do, and you can't tell anybody we asked. There was a very bizarre case, and again, this was back in the Clinton administration, where this newspaper was trying to go public with a story, and the court ordered them not to print the story. Violation would have meant contempt of court and prison, and then turned around and ordered the newspaper not to report on the court decision that led to that action. That's also prior restraint and a violation of the First Amendment. We have a government that very clearly does not think the rules should apply to them, and that is what makes it an illegitimate and illegal government. Edward Snowden's coming out with more information, in particular that the NSA was targeting journalists critical of the government after 9/11. In other words, meaning those who did not buy the official story or buy the poison the well hoax about no plane. And they're sure piling on to me about that issue right now. More about that later on here. But basically said the NSA was spying on anybody expressing any doubt about the official story on 9/11. And of course, it's a given they're monitoring this radio show, and we know they're monitoring the website because a while back somebody put out a Firefox plugin that would play music if you were visiting a website known to be monitored by the NSA, and I took the plugin out of Firefox because I got sick of listening to the music every time I was updating my own page. Another article coming out of computerworld.com, no, your data is not secure in the cloud. No big shock there. Apparently in 2012, Google alone received 21,000 government requests for information affecting 33,000 user accounts. All without warrants, all in violation of the Fourth Amendment. Google users have launched a class action lawsuit against Google, which Google is attempting to rebut in court by saying anybody who uses their services at Google, like Gmail, do not have a legitimate expectation of privacy, that anybody using Gmail should just assume that their emails are being scanned by Google, by advertisers, by corporations, by the NSA, and that you have no privacy in online mail. Now, common sense told us all along that that was true. And you would have to be pretty naive to be sending any kind of confidential communications through the email without some form of encryption. But Google's legal defense against the class action lawsuit of simply turning over content to the government without a warrant is, hey, you shouldn't be expecting privacy using our service. And I think probably people ought to start getting off of Gmail and go with more secure, more privacy-centric email providers. If you're a technical whiz, maybe you should set up your own email server. They're not that difficult to do, especially if you're on a Linux box. You don't have to go through a big corporation for email. You can send and receive email from your own server using your own system. And the internet will take the mail packets and forward them and deliver them. It's one of the big illusions today that you have to go through one of these big corporations to send and receive email. It's absolutely not true. You can have an email server on your own computer that will bypass Google completely. All right, we're going to take another break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Interesting story coming out of Natural News. Now, we know that there are hackers and cyber criminals who will go out and block your website and until you pay a ransom, where all of a sudden your website comes back online or your browser comes back online. But all of a sudden, it's starting to look like the big commercial internet security companies are playing the same game. And when I first read this story, the first thing I thought is, oh, this just can't be that true. But it was originally reported over at therebel.org about how McAfee, which is one of the big antivirus, anti-malware providers, blacklisted Natural News. Now, Natural News, as the name implies, it's all about health and natural cures, natural remedies. It's a huge threat, obviously, to big pharmaceutical companies. But they don't have porn and they don't have malware, but McAfee listed it and said, oh, there was all kinds of problems there. Then they turned around and offered a deal to Natural News. In exchange for $32,000, McAfee would recertify Natural News as safe to be seen by any of the users of McAfee. It's the old protection racket going on out there. And I went over to Natural News and basically got a confirmation from that. These gatekeeper security companies are now in a position to block websites that offend some corporate interest or some foreign government. and say, we'll unblock you in exchange for a lot of money. And by the way, my website, whatreallyhappened.com, is on many of those lists, because there are a lot of people who do not want the truth to get out in this world. And I think, given that demonstrably many of these so-called security systems actually open up more security holes than they close, I'm not sure that they're worth all that much. It's just the protection racket. You know, you got to pay us protection or something bad going to happen to your computer. We're going to grab a phone call here. Jim in Georgia. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hello, Michael. I've got a question for you, and maybe you can answer it for me. And I don't deal with the Internet, but I do a lot with the U.S. postage. And what's your opinion about when I mail a letter to someone through the postage, my privacy? How do you feel about my privacy without them going into my mail or opening it?
Okay, now the letter of the law, which really doesn't mean anything in this day and age, but the letter of the law is interfering, opening, or reading private sealed postal mail is a felony. And believe it or not, that actually came out of a scandal that happened, I think it was back in the 1920s, where the Catholic churches were exhorting Catholic postal workers to lose and interfere with mail going to and from Protestant churches. And it blew up into a huge scandal, and as a result, the U.S. government basically passed a law, the Congress passed a law saying that tampering or interfering with the paper mail is a felony. Now, we know our government's intelligence agencies really don't care about that. We know the outside of all mail is being scanned in order to keep a record of mail as it travels from point A to point B in case there's something nefarious inside, like a 64 gigabyte micro SD hiding under the stamp, which seems to get through the Postal Service quite easily, I might add. But we also know that this government would not hesitate to open mail and read it, and has been all along. In fact, I remember many years ago being shown this spray can of a chemical, and I don't remember what the chemical was, but you could spray a letter with it, and the paper would be instantly transparent, was smelly as all get out. And you could hold it up to the light and pretty much see everything that was inside the envelope. And then as the chemical evaporated, the paper went back to being non-transparent. So they actually manufacture and sell products to make it possible for government agents to peek inside your mail and leave no trace that it's been looked at. This government has declared war on the privacy of the American people.
So the answer to my question is, I don't have the privacy. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying you don't have a guarantee of privacy anywhere in the United States of America. Your privacy is protected as long as you're not doing something of any particular interest to anybody. If you're just an ordinary person sending, mail back and forth to family relations, they're probably not looking at it because they don't have the manpower to do it. But they have the possibility, and they certainly are not constrained by the laws against it.
Thank you, Michael.
All right. Okay, moving right along here. Very interesting article coming out of smellslikethehumanspirit.com, and it's talking about the CIA's role in Hollywood. And we know intelligence agencies have tried to co-opt and control the corporate media, including the film industry, going back to the days when J. Edgar Hoover was trying to convince Charlie Chaplin not to make fun of government officials in his silent movies. And Chaplin told him, no, that's what my audience wants to see. Government officials acting as oafish, overbearing buffoons, because that's the kind of personality government work attracts. And J. Edgar Hoover retaliated eventually by having Chaplin's citizenship revoked. It actually took a special act of Congress to let Chaplin back into the United States to get his Lifetime Achievement Award from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Talk about carrying a grudge to ridiculous levels. So anyway, this article's going on about, the very obvious influence of the CIA in Hollywood. And again, I ran into this myself when I was at CBS Television City, when I was approached by some people who wanted to try and recruit me until I saw what they wanted me to do, which had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with making sure the CIA's people moved ahead and the non-CIA people got thrown out in the street. And at that point, they began to really look more like mafia wrapped in the American flag than anything else, and I bowed out, which is probably why my career never went anywhere. And I'm not going to go into the details about what is claimed in this article, except that I mentioned it as a prelude to a movie called Olympus Has Fallen, which just hit the cable TV systems. And Claire and I watched it last night so we could cheer and applaud when the White House was being bombed and shot up and everything. Very expensively produced movie. Very lame, simple plot line. Secret Service agent with guilt over losing the First Lady redeems himself by saving the White House from terrorists single-handed. And the bad guys in this film were all North Koreans. Oh, the North Koreans are coming. And the first thing that hit my mind when I saw that the villain were North Koreans. What? They've run out of evil Muslims to put in the movies? And I went back, and do you remember when this film hit the theaters was exactly the same time the United States government was trying to gin up popular support for a war in North Korea? What an amazing coincidence that just as the government is trying to gin up war in North Korea, screaming they have warheads and rockets that'll reach the United States, that Hollywood obligingly provides them with a movie about North Koreans attacking the White House and trying to blow up all of America's nuclear weapons to turn America into a nuclear wasteland. Now, it takes a long time to produce a movie like that, more than a year. So somebody somewhere inside Hollywood got the phone call saying, we're going to go to war against North Korea, thus and such, have a movie ready to go. At that time, we'll make sure you get your funding. From all my years working in the film industry, I know, I've seen it myself. It's used by the government for propaganda purposes, and those who go along will become stars, and those who do not go along get blacklisted. Now, there's an article at my website called The New McCarthyism that I wrote a while back, detailing this very long history of government influence in the entertainment industry for propaganda purposes, and how those who went along were rewarded, and those who didn't go along were basically kicked out, including the McCarthy hearings, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, whose job it was to purge Hollywood of anybody not willing to go along with the demonization of the Soviet Union in support of the Cold War. And that article, The New McCarthyism, is in the permanent little submenu bar at the top of the page. It's also linked to the article about Olympus Has Fallen, and you might want to take a read through that, because this is old story. And again, back in COINTELPRO in the 1960s, there was this very famous actress, Jean Seberg. Very famous, very popular in Europe, very popular in the United States of America. And she was very much a supporter of the civil rights movement. And the FBI set out to destroy her career, and they succeeded. This is what the FBI does. Go out and destroy anybody standing up to the government, because at that time the White House did not want the civil rights movement to gain any voice with the public, because the civil rights movement was focusing on the Vietnam draft, putting all those black kids out there on the front lines to catch the bullets. Got to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. And over the last several weeks, we have begun to see the American corporate media start to realize they're no longer in control of the thoughts of the American people or the thoughts of the world. And we're already starting to see some gratuitous bashing coming out here. Over in Der Spiegel in Germany, they're trying to take to task Russia Today. And the spin of the article is Putin's weapon in the war of images. And Putin has created an anti-CNN for Western audiences. And then they go on to basically attack Abby Martin, and who's done a lot of really good reporting on Russia Today. I've been on her show once. And Der Spiegel basically doesn't talk about what she's saying or what she's reporting. They go on about, has her lips slightly parted, is applying red lipstick, which goes well with her black top, high heels, and ankle tattoo. And you know when they go on and on about her appearance, it's a hit piece. It's a hit piece from a corporate media that is losing viewership because of its continued obeisance to vested government and corporate interests. Now, I'm not saying that Abby Martin isn't pleasant to look at, because she is. But the reason all of these corporate networks and newspapers are losing audience to Russia Today and to RBN and to What Really Happened is that nobody likes a liar. And that constant caterwauling of, we must support Israel, we must support Israel, we must support Israel from the American media is boring. We're tired of hearing about it. We're tired of a corporate media that has completely abandoned its role as watchdog on government abuse, which, by the way, was another comment Edward Snowden was making. And he's absolutely right. We would not be here, meaning WhatReallyHappened.com or RBN, if the corporate media was actually performing its traditional role of telling us what the government is doing that is wrong, illegal, immoral, and unethical. But they won't do it. They're not doing their job. They're acting as a propaganda ministry for the U.S. government and Israel's government and advertising for pretty much everybody else. The corporate media lies about everything except the sports scores and the weather, and they're not even very good on the weather. And that is why the American public and the world audience are turning away from these large corporate media structures, and they're coming to blogs like WhatReallyHappened.com. And independent media like Republic Broadcasting, because they know they need to find out what's going on in the world. And they're not going to get it from that big view screen on the wall with the fancy graphics. And by the way, for all the bashing about Abby Martin's appearance, have you noticed that the American corporate media like Fox and CNN and MSNBC, they're going the Babe route as well. They're starting to turn into the video equivalent of supermarket tabloids. Just anything to lure you in and feed you junk. And people around the world are waking up and realizing these are very dark and dangerous times, and they have a need and a desire to know what's really going on in the world. And they know they're not going to get it from the corporate media, mostly because the entire corporate media stood shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. federal government about Saddam's nuclear weapons of mass destruction. They lied, they lied, they lied, they lied. And the American people don't trust the corporate media, which is why they're taking it upon themselves to go out on the World Wide Web and find out for themselves what's going on. The big lie of TV news is that it is informing you when it does not inform you, claims to educate you while not educating you, and just keeps you distracted with condensation, celebrity news, sex scandals. And they won't talk about what really happened in Benghazi. They won't talk about the correct state of the economy. They won't talk about all the corruption that's going on. And then they wonder why they're losing their audience. And I'm sure over there in the boardrooms of the corporate media, they're saying, we need more hot babes. How about after 10 o'clock they go topless? Which has already been done. There used to be a website, I don't know if they're still out there or not, called nakednews.com, which was a very bizarre news broadcast where they're actually reporting the news of the day with totally naked newscasters. Oh, my goodness. They even had a cable deal for a while, I think. Now then, I mentioned this earlier in the show, and I want to get back to it. This is an article coming out of Medium.com. How the U.S. and its allies got stuck with the world's worst new warplane. And it's basically a castigation of the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, which we've been talking about for quite a long time. The F-35 Joint Strike Fighter was meant to improve the U.S. air arsenal and the arsenal of our allies who were convinced to buy this thing. And it's turned out to be a complete disaster. These air forces using these planes are now more vulnerable than they were before using the earlier aircraft. And we have detailed many, many times the problems with this aircraft. Can't fly in the fog, can't fly in the rain, can't fly near a thunder shower, no rear visibility, flies slower, less maneuverable than it was supposed to, heavier than it was supposed to be. The Pentagon has already rewritten the statement of requirements downward so they can say, yes, we accept the plane, it achieved its goals. But it hasn't. And now the Pentagon is actually talking about scrapping the entire project after having spent more than the gross domestic product of Australia developing it. It's a classic military boondoggle. Trillions of dollars poured into this thing. And they got a piece of junk for it. And it's a reminder that just because the United States spends more on their military than the next 26 nations combined, 25 of whom are supposed to be allies, doesn't mean we actually have a superior warfighting capability. Because if we're pouring trillions and trillions of dollars into total junk merely to enrich the cronies of the military-industrial complex, and our soldiers and sailors and air persons out there in the field are being given this junk to fight with, they're going to lose. again, if you've never seen it, there's a book and a movie called The Pentagon Wars. It's a very funny movie. It was directed by Richard Benjamin, and he did a great job on it. And it's a comedy based on the true story of the development of the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. And it is a portrait of just how this whole weapons procurement program is just nothing about ego and vanity and making huge amounts of money and getting promotions. And our kids out there in uniform in the war zones are getting junk. Remember that scandal they had a while back where they were buying this electronic device to detect improvised explosive devices? And it turned out it was a complete fraud. This guy had just found this missing golf ball detector novelty item, repainted it, and sold it as an IED detector. Made millions and millions of dollars before he was caught. They're not paying attention. They don't care about whether the weapons actually work. It's all about getting the money, getting it in, getting it out there to the cronies, and taking a piece of the action. Now, as I mentioned before on the show, and this is over at antiwar.com, the 341st Missile Wing of the United States Air Force, which is one of the 3 units in charge of the Minuteman III nuclear ICBMs, failed an inspection over safety and security of those nuclear warheads. And by the way, this is the second such unit to fail an inspection over the past 3 months. We're always being told, oh, we have to go into Pakistan. Terrorists might get the weapons away from the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. Well, they could do it right here in the United States of America. Our government isn't securing these most deadly of weapons of mass destruction. It's a complete joke. They just spend all the money, they buy all the stuff, they put it in a warehouse and let it rot away. To keep looting people from looting money from the American people is what they're doing here. Now then, we've been talking about this story out in California, where the city of Richmond is going to use eminent domain to basically seize homes under foreclosure, then sell them back to the families being foreclosed on for a more realistic valuation of what the house is really worth. And the bankers are in an uproar over that. They're threatening to cut off all banking services to the city, which might actually work out to be really well. And when we come back, a new wrinkle in this whole equation. We'll be right back after Phyllis Shapley. America, welcome back to hour number 2 of our program. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And we're talking about the city of Richmond, California, which decided to use its powers of eminent domain to try and save some of their residents who were facing foreclosure. And the city was going to say, using eminent domain, we're going to seize this land, and then we're going to turn around and sell it back to the people living in the home for what is a more reasonable price for that home, so that they can get a new mortgage at lower payments to save the people, save the homeowners. And the bankers threw a tantrum saying, we will cut off the city from all banking services. I don't think they're really going to do it, because Richmond might discover that life actually gets a lot better when you're not using a currency that's accruing interest to a private central bank. You know why doctors very rarely go out on strike these days? Because every time they do, the death rates go down and people start talking about it. And the same thing is going to be true if there's a banking strike. We're going to stop issuing the money and see how you do. All right, we'll just create our own. Interest-free. Life will get better. Now, just in case there was any lingering doubt on just whose side the federal government is on, whether it's we the people or the money junkies, the U.S. government is now threatening the city of Richmond, California, saying that if they move forward with their eminent domain plan, that the federal government will get involved to shut them down. And so now you know whose side the federal government is on. It's not on the side of ordinary Americans who are struggling to deal with this economic crisis. It is firmly on the side of those Wall Street financial firms whose crimes and corruptions created the economic crisis. Meanwhile, Congress has started investigating Bitcoin. They're subpoenaing all the people behind it. Had a court ruling saying it is a currency and therefore must be regulated the way the dollar and gold is, meaning Wall Street has to be empowered to manipulate it and rig it. And we're seeing a continuance of the policy coming out of the federal government that you dare not use a currency that is not borrowed at interest from the Federal Reserve. You will be dependent on that Federal Reserve Just like the British government said, you will be dependent on those banknotes from the Bank of England. And again, go back to that pretty printed piece of paper, the Federal Reserve note, and it says there right above the seal of the Federal Reserve, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. The word that is missing is only. This is not the only legal tender. It's one legal tender. It's a legal tender. And as the Federal Reserve note continues to slide in value and trustworthiness, it is legitimate for the people of the United States of America, just as it's legitimate for foreign governments, to say, we're not going to use that Federal Reserve note any longer. We're going to set up something for ourselves that works better for the people. And the Federal Reserve and Wall Street are using the power of the government to keep you in slavery to those paper chains made of Federal Reserve notes. And that's exactly what King George III did to the American colonies with his Currency Act, which is what led to the American Revolution. All righty, moving right along. We mentioned this story last week about how the Oklahoma Department of Human Services basically takes children away from their parents for issues like neglect. And apparently a head count came up 78 short. In other words, 78 children taken from their parents by the Oklahoma Department of Human Services for neglect by the parents has simply, they've vanished. They vanished. Now, the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, every time they take a child, their funding goes up to care for that child. And so the question is, where did those kids go? And earlier today I saw another article suggesting that the Oklahoma Department of Human Services be investigated for child sex trafficking because nobody can figure out where these kids went. And we know that a lot of institutions that have a public image of caring for children turn out to be something quite different, whether it's the residence schools up in Canada or Boys Town that got implicated in the Franklin scandal. Those kids have to be somewhere. And that government agency had better come up with a really good explanation of where they went really, really soon. All right, we're going to talk about some stinky badges here for a while because a lot of people are commenting on this growing trend of police abuse and brutality against the American people. And I think the agenda here is one of continued repression of the American people by conditioning us all to react in fear when we see a police uniform. Used to be that the police were there to protect and to serve, and the police were your friend, and you were supposed to be buddy-buddy with them, and when you saw a uniform, you were supposed to relax and say, okay, things are cool, crooks aren't going to be around, the cops are here. And it's been a complete reversal now, with all the abuse and tasering and just gunning down of people for tripping on a seatbelt. And I think the goal here is to make the people just afraid of a uniform as part of that repression. And we have seen this skyrocketing of police brutality concurrent with this trend of U.S. police departments hiring Israeli experts to train their police departments how to keep the people in place. There is no other description for it here. Let's see, I think we mentioned this yesterday. This Texas trooper, Jenny Bui, I believe the name is pronounced here, was fired after she sexually violated 2 women on their way home from a day at the beach with the families. And she should have been fired, but she's been rehired. She's back at her job, even though there are still additional charges pending against her for sexually groping women she stops by the side of the road. There was a SWAT team raid on a sustainable organic co-op. This is people who just got together, had a plot of land, started growing food for themselves, non-GMO, in order to provide their own food without having to go be dependent on some giant food corporation. And I guess because of that, the SWAT team raided the co-op, ostensibly because they were convinced marijuana was growing there. They spent tens of thousands of tax dollars and hundreds of cumulative man hours. Not one marijuana plant was found. It was just outright harassment of people trying to grow their own food. And we have seen more and more from the U.S. Department of Agriculture a policy that you and I are not supposed to buy food from the farmers who actually grow it. Oh, no, 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 no. Those farmers must sell their food to giant food corporations who will then truck it 3 time zones one way, let it sit in a warehouse for a month, truck it 3 time zones back the other way, and then sell it to you at a supermarket. You're not allowed to bypass that large corporation. You will be dependent on that giant corporation. And they keep putting up more and more impediments to small farmers operating roadside stands to sell produce, local farmers markets, and let's be honest, the food you get from those local farmer markets far less likely to be GMO, certainly going to be far fresher because they just picked it right out of the garden. But that's not the new model for the United States of America. Take it out of the ground, package it, dose it with chemicals, wrap it, truck it all over the place, leave it in a warehouse, put it in a store, and then sell it. And it's nowhere near as fresh and healthy. But it makes money. That's what it's about. It's enforced dependency. Over in Cleveland, 74 police officers are facing discipline after a deadly pursuit in which 2 people were killed in a hail of 137 bullets, involving 104 officers involved in this chase. It's almost half the entire police force said, "Yeehaw, chase, let's go get them." And they caught these guys and fired 137 bullets and killed these 2 people. That's really an inappropriate reaction. And so they're being disciplined, which means nothing will happen. They'll conclude, oh, yes, it's department policy. You know, if we have a reason to shoot you, we'll empty the gun at you, and you can't do anything about it. Remember that guy getting out of a truck, stumbled on his seatbelt, cop emptied his magazine into the guy. Hello, we'll be right America. Back. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about a pattern of repression of the people by police terror tactics, and that's exactly what it is. Over in Indianapolis, there was a story where this 60-year-old businessman, and I empathize because I'm 60 myself, was standing in the lobby of the JW Marriott Hotel and having a dispute over hotel services. And this police officer interjected into the debate and wound up beating up this 60-year-old man. I think we would all agree that was a very inappropriate thing for the officer to do. And somehow he got the Officer of the Year award. Yes, for outstanding service in clubbing one of our tourists staying at our city hotels, you will get this gold thing to hang on the wall to reassure yourself that what you did was right here. Let's see, another story here at the North Park Mall in Davenport. A police officer accused a woman of shoplifting and beat her so severely she lost most of the sight in one eye and had to go to the hospital. Whatever happened to, I'm taking you under arrest, here's the handcuffs, so forth and so on. Another one of these City of Arlington SWAT raid on peaceful organic farmers. I think that's the same story I mentioned before here. And it goes on and on and on. The police are not out there to stop crime. They're there to keep you afraid, keep you from standing up. They're out there to attack the protesters and the people who are very unhappy with the way this financial system and this government is running this nation here. Apparently, U.S. Congressman Jeff Duncan is continuing to make an issue of something he stumbled on last May, in which he witnessed IRS agents training with AR-15 rifles. These are the same kind of rifles the U.S. government is trying to insist you, the American people, do not have a legitimate need to own. Now, the IRS, remember, is a private corporation. They're not actually chartered as a law enforcement agency, but they, like every other federal government agency, is arming up right now. The polite term for it, at least over at the Internal Revenue Service, is it's called a standoff capability, which, if you think about it, what it means is they are foreseeing a time when there's going to be an altercation with 100,000 angry taxpayers on one side, aware that the 16th Amendment was never actually ratified and the whole thing is a fraud, and on the other side there are going to be some IRS workers given AR-15s to hold them off and protect the top management of the IRS. And if the top management of the IRS thinks these low-level workers are going to risk their lives to protect their bosses from an enraged American people, they are seriously deluded. Those IRS workers are going to run like heck. And we'll pick up those AR-15s and we'll sell them surplus. Never fired, only dropped once. So we're coming down to the point where the U.S. government understands that the American people recognize this government is not complying with the law. And the U.S. government is preparing to declare war on the 50 states and the American people. They're just looking for an excuse, which I think they were trying with last July 4th with Adam Kokesh's armed march into Washington, D.C., and when that fell apart, they were trying to fan up race riots over George Zimmerman. That didn't work because we're on to their tricks. Now they're getting ready for the Million Muslim March into Washington, D.C. They're going to go on trying until they can get some kind of violence that looks like the people are getting violent with the government, so the government is justified getting violent with the American people. Please do not fall for it. The very last thing you should do right now is initiate violence against the government, because that is what they want. On the other hand, prudence and common sense says that you should be fully prepared to defend yourself and your family when the government initiates violence against you. Just common sense. That's why we have a Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is about reserving to the American people the same arms carried and used by the standing army. That's why it talks about security and militia. It's not talking about hunting, not talking about target shooting. It's talking about the security of a free state. And that was upheld in a United States Supreme Court decision, United States versus Miller, which ruled the Second Amendment specifically refers to military-style arms. And the context of the case was that Miller was charged with possessing a sawed-off shotgun. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court when Miller's saying that the Second Amendment says I can have a sawed-off shotgun, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't unless the Army itself is using one, which they weren't at the time. And so the Miller decision absolutely affirmed that what the Second Amendment is talking about is you are allowed, you have a right, not allowed, you have a right. The government recognizes your right to keep and bear arms equal to those of the standing army. That's what that's all about. Going to grab a phone call here. John in Barbados. Aloha, John. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hi, Michael. Long time since I last called in, but I'm calling in now. I'm going to be talking about this disaster in Fukushima and the radiation that is being talked about, but mainly because what they're really not talking about is all the different isotopes, particularly strontium-90, which is the most dangerous and long-lasting one that we know of, that is in abundance coming out of this plant. They keep piling water on, and all the water is doing is going into the second containment chamber, and being as they've had the meltdown right through, this water is going into the ground and literally undermining the foundations of the whole structures.
It is, and not only that, Reuters just reported today that reactor building number 4 is now so badly corroded it could just collapse on itself. Now, the reason for all the water continuing to be poured in is because it is still very hot underneath the reactors. They don't want to talk about it, but that's the real problem. The fission products...
the real problem, Michael, I mean, this was my speciality in the military, was nuclear weapons and things allied to it. Basically, these meltdowns are continuing the fusion process in deep underground.
Fission.
It's not stopped.
Fission. They're continuing the fission process deep underground.
Fission, sorry, yeah. The fission, yeah, exactly. But the other thing I wanted to talk about was this problem with Syria. And the Syrian army is clearly beating the pants off the Israeli, British, French, U.S. Imported militants.
Yes.
But once this, the Syrian army gets real control, I can see these militants zooming back over to the border in the surrounding states and making their way back home to their various nations, UK, France, Germany, wherever, with arms. And this is going to be a real problem I can see coming up in the near future. I mean, eventually these terrorists are going to realize they're onto a loser, and let's get the hell out before we die and can't spend our ill-gotten gains being provided by the various supporting states of France, Britain,
Okay,
and
well,
America.
there's two different groups that were on the side of the mercenaries. There were the hired mercenaries themselves who, when the contract is over, they'll just go to the next contract, the next trouble spot where they're going to be paid to go in and kill people. But underneath them, they had succeeded in propagandizing and recruiting a large number of the Syrian people themselves onto their side who were lulled into thinking it was a popular revolution against Assad. Now they realize it isn't, and Assad has very wisely and smartly offered an amnesty to anybody who comes back, and they are. They're dropping their guns, they're abandoning the hired mercenary army, they're going back to the Syrian government side, and that is why the balance of force is shifting so dramatically against the covert attempted an overthrow, which is why we have so many people in the U.S. government screaming, we've got to invade, we're losing control of the situation. And by the way, on a side note, over in Bahrain, which is a U.S.-supported dictatorship, they're dealing with massive protests there. The aircraft carrier Nimitz is now off the shore of Bahrain to offer air support to the Bahraini government against their protesters. And that'll tell you the true character of the U.S. government and whether it believes in democracy or not. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show here. An interesting article over at the Huffington Post. Here are all the nations that incarcerate more of their population than the United States. That was it. That was the list of all the nations that incarcerate more of their population than the United States of America. The United States incarcerates a higher percentage of their population than any other nation on earth. Prisons are big business, especially those factory prisons, those privately operated factory prisons that operate call centers and light manufacturing for less than minimum wage. They're hugely profitable. Judges have been caught accepting bribes to send people to prison to fill job openings over there. I remember when I was a kid, other countries with huge prison populations, that was seen a sign of dictatorship and decay. And now here we are. The United States is the world's leader in per capita percentage of imprisonment. Now, a little while back, I took issue with Harry Reid, who had an interview in the Las Vegas Sun pushing the global warming agenda. And he was coming out with the same old tired and already discredited claims and about global warming and it's all the fault of humans and so forth. And I responded to his article. He made the claim basically that the wildfires all over the West are the result of global warming. And the reason we have all these wildfires all over the West raging out of control is because funding for brush management and maintenance of the fire roads and firefighting equipment has been slashed due to austerity so that more taxpayer money can be poured onto Wall Street and into these endless wars of conquest to bring the world back to Bretton Woods. And I chastised Harry Reid as being a leader in that Congress that set those priorities. And the response was furious. Just pouring on there, no, global warming is real, you're a kook, you're a gatekeeper, you're this, you're that, you want the earth to die, and all this other hysterical stuff. And from the ferocity, I began to wonder, what the heck is going on there? And then I just got a listener email from somebody who got a campaign message from Senator Boxer, sounding the clear warning on the state of planet Earth and climate change and global warming has got to be dealt with. And then earlier today we had this story where John Kerry, in one of his press conferences down in Brazil, probably grateful to have something to talk about that isn't the NSA spying, was saying that Obama will act on climate change without congressional approval. And so it looks like this is the kickoff of the propaganda campaign to convince Americans that, oh, yes, there has to be a carbon tax to save the planet Earth from all of you horrible human beings. And Obama's going to do it without congressional approval, which means he's going to sign an executive order saying there's now a carbon tax or some other such nonsense. Now, the reality is that human-caused global warming is not science, It's not consensus. It's politics and propaganda. And all of the dire prognostications made by the hysterical global warming, the warmistas, 10 years ago did not happen. 10 years ago, publications like The Guardian were saying snow was going to be a thing of the past, and we've had several record-setting winters since then. The Carbonazis were caught outright falsifying the data that went into their pretty little hockey stick chart, rigging the computer code so it would always add more heat as it got past that transition point. They were faking it. They were caught faking it to sell the world on the need for buying and selling carbon credits to make people like Al Gore rich, and that succeeded, by the way. To sell us all on the idea that we have to pay a carbon tax to save planet Earth, and that we have to submit to a global environmental authority that will decide for us how we choose to live. And it's all complete nonsense. It's another fraud. And you need to remember, they've been screaming about global warming since the 1800s. 1850, I think it was. And then again, they did it. They tried it again in 1922. World will end with severe global warming. And then they tried it again in 1947. Then they decided to take a break. And in 1974 and 1975, the scientists and the corporate media were proclaiming a coming ice age. There's a new ice age on the way. And then back in the 1990s, it's global warming. We're all going to roast and we're all going to bake. And there's a very simple mechanism behind all of this stuff. If you're a scientist and you go out there and say, I discovered this very interesting phenomenon, but it's probably of no real significance, you're not going to get media attention and you're not going to get a lot of funding. But if you're a scientist and you say, I've discovered this little phenomenon here and it could be the end of the world, then the media will pile on for the sensationalist headlines and funding will follow. Which is why we got stuff like killer bees and Y2K and the coming ice age in the 1970s and human-caused global warming. And it isn't science, it's propaganda. It's another Hegelian dialectic, taking something that happens naturally, climate change, declaring it a crisis, and then offering to sell you, the suckers, a solution to it. Because that's how politicians operate. These people can't deal with a real problem. They can't deal with Fukushima. They can't deal with oil and Corexit in the Gulf of Mexico. They can't deal with the GMO problems in the agricultural produce. They don't know how to fix any of that stuff. All they know how to do is to make up these imaginary hobgoblins and then say, I will save you from this if you will give me your money in obedience. And a story out of AccuWeather.com is basically saying, taken as a whole, global temperature variability has been constant over the last 50 years. The United Nations came out and said that there actually has been no global warming since the year 2000. It hasn't happened. We still have the Arctic ice caps. In fact, this summer they set a new record for extent. The polar bears are not going extinct. In fact, they're multiplying so rapidly on the larger Arctic ice caps. Now it's legal to hunt them again because there's too many. They're turning into a problem. Back in 2008, NASA predicted the climate tipping point. That was their big selling point. No, we're not seeing a lot of warming here with this thing, but we're going to reach that magic point where all of a sudden it'll just descend into chaos and all sorts of bad things will happen. That was supposed to happen in 2008. And of course, that didn't materialize. NASA's now deleting those reports and videos from their websites. Whoopsie, our bad. Arctic sets new record for largest increase in summer sea ice. That was reported over... I got a bad link on that, so I can't tell you that. Arctic ice extent more than double last year's minimum. That's over at Stephen Goddard's website. Let's see. According to the DMI temperature plot, the high Arctic has dropped below freezing 2 weeks early in the season. That was reported over at What's Up With That. It's another government hoax to trick you out of money and obedience. And they're pounding on it almost as hard as they're pounding on the no-plane nonsense. They're pushing the agenda. It's all all that's about. Remember that story that came out where the government of Israel is now openly paying students to sit at home. You don't worry about going out and having to work at a burger joint. The government of Israel will pay you to sit at home when you're a college student. When you're done with your homework, go online, go to Facebook, go to whatreallyhappened.com, and just post pro-Israel propaganda constantly. We will give you money. And if Israel is doing it, so are other governments and corporations. Public relations firms like Hill and Knowlton openly advertise on their website, their list of services. They will have crowds of people show up at a targeted website to hurl invective and abuse at anybody who's daring to say anything the corporations or governments don't approve of. It's massive, massive propaganda campaigns. Probably the only part of the economy that's growing right now. This government has ruled with lies, fraud, and deception so long, they don't know any other way to work. That's their problem. They're trapped by their own recent history. These are not people who actually know anything they're talking about. That's why it's a problem for them. All right, we're going to take a break. We got a caller waiting on the line, and I'm going to take that phone call as soon as we're back from these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to go to the phones here. Scott in Wisconsin. Aloha. Thank you for waiting. What's on your mind today?
Brother Mike, how you doing there? Well, I've been taking care of my garden in my backyard, and I tell you something.
Oh, careful! They're going. The SWAT team's going to raid you, thinking you're growing marijuana out there.
Boy. Well, I'll tell you what I'm battling with is with the squirrels and the rabbits and all that, but I got the old shotgun repellent on there, and they're staying off there. So, you know, Mike, I was we talked about this cyber attack, and I thank you for staying up on it. But I was reading an article here. Listen to this one. It says the U.S. electrical grid is better managed and more flexible. A decade after its largest blackout, but remains vulnerable to extreme weather, cybersecurity threats, and stress caused by shifts in where it has no power produced. Isn't that amazing, man?
Yeah, we're doing a great job, but we're in trouble. That's basically what they're saying.
Yeah. Basically, it's saying, well, exactly. You butter it up and then hammer it down. Mike, you know, I wanted to point you out into the listeners. I follow these guys as long as you, and they're fire guys fight for the truth. And if I could, I would like to mention Wide Awake News. If you want to write that down and check out Charlie McGriff. This guy, he was in the military, but he's awake like you, and he fires those old the truth out. And then the other one is Green Wave News. Green Wave, and that's Christopher Green. And Christopher Green, he's another guy that just steps out on the limb and lets it fly about a lot of what you're talking about, but you can really find some good in-depth stuff from those two websites there, because these two guys are fighting for America just like you right now, and I just like to point those out if I could. So.
All right. Well, we'll take note of those, and I'm familiar with Charlie, of course, and his work. I'm not less so the other gentleman there. Is there anything else you want?
Well, Mike, you know what? I just wanted to. Thanks for being patient, but the thing that I would say to America is, I always fire off something that, and I appreciate you letting me, but it's two words, and it goes back to what you were saying. They're trying everything they can do to start an implication of getting the American people fired up. But there's two words that Americans better remember when they read the Constitution or wake up to this. And the one word is panic, and the other word is humble. And if you're going to panic, those are the people that are going to be in trouble. So, Mike, thanks for taking my call, and you take care, and you be safe, brother.
All right, thanks an awful lot here. Actually, the only ones that I see panicking are the Wall Street and Washington, D.C. people. They're in a complete panic because all of a sudden they have lost the trust of the American people. And government and banking operate like religions. They survive only on the blind faith of the supplicants or the masses, and they've lost that. And they're trying to figure out some way they can regain it. In fact, I just saw this story here where now the United Nations is saying, oh, the internet and social media, it's got to be brought under some kind of control because of all the hate speech out there. Well, when you're a government that lies, the truth is considered hate speech. They're trying to spin it as somehow this is a good thing to take away your right to freedom of expression. Because all it takes is hiring a few bozos to go on out there and scream some of those words we're all brainwashed to be offended at, and oh, yes, we've got to have control on the internet. And they've tried that before. Back in the days of the Exxon Amendment, I've told you this story before, when that was all coming up for debate in Congress, the internet was being flooded with porn into completely inappropriate Usenet groups. And the people in those Usenet groups were trying to self-police and tell the posters there are other sections in Usenet where this stuff is supposed to go. And we would get this, I have a First Amendment right to put this anywhere I want. Into the cooking groups, into the biscuit group, into the tatting groups. And that's when it became obvious it was a government operation, and most of these posters' IPs did track back to government and military websites. And Senator Exxon got up there in Congress and said, there's a scourge of porn all over the internet, and we must have firmer government control. And he was holding up a book that was filled with the exact same images of porn that had been flooded into the news groups. And as soon as his speech was over and the vote was done, the flood of porn turned off like a switch had been thrown. That's how the government works. They're going to create the impression of some kind of a crisis and then say, if you will support me and give us your money and obedience, we'll make the problem go away. And now it's hate speech. Surrender your freedom to freely express yourself on the internet, and we'll make sure those words that you're brainwashed to be offended at will go away. That's the scam that's going on now. Now, when Scott was starting his phone call and he was talking about a cyber attack on the financial system, seems like a good time to bring this up. A couple of months ago, we were hearing this constant harangue about how Al-Qaeda hackers or Chinese hackers or Russian hackers or any nation the United States government wants to invade hackers were planning on destroying the computer systems of the Wall Street Financial Center. And now we're seeing a replay of that same propaganda coming out of the European media. And it's another setup for another fraud. Because the reality is this financial system is on the edge of collapse. It's being held together entirely through fraud and lie and deception right now. Nobody's intentionally trying to take down the American system. The problem is they can't stop it from happening. Their own greed and ineptitude put them into a financial corner where this private central bank Ponzi scheme has generated an unimaginable amount of debt that cannot be paid because the money to pay that debt simply does not exist. And the only way new money enters the system is as another loan at interest. So the debt always climbs faster than the available money supply with which to pay that debt. It's a pyramid scheme, and the people who set it up knew it would collapse eventually, but they didn't care because it was going to happen after they were dead, after enjoying lives of wealth and luxury and privilege, all in exchange for some ink and paper. And so what I think is going on with all this talk about evil terrorists taking down the computers of the financial system is at the point where they cannot hold off the collapse any longer. It is the U.S. government itself that will crash the Wall Street financial computers so they can duck the blame. Oh, gee whiz, we were just on the verge of turning the economy around. We had found the magical incantations where everything was going to be great. And those dastardly Iranian, Chinese, Russian hackers destroyed the financial system. And now we don't know who owes what money or who owns everything. So we're going to have to nationalize it all and manage it for the benefit of the nation. And it allows them to duck the responsibility that the condition the nation is in right now is wholly the fault of Wall Street and Washington, D.C.'s fascist economic dictatorship. But these are not people who, by their nature, are willing to admit error or wrongdoing, let alone take responsibility for their crimes and corruptions. They're looking for a scapegoat. And that's what all this talk about cyber attack on the banking system is all about. Why would hackers deliberately attack the U.S. financial system when it is in the middle of destroying itself? Just sit back, stay patient, eat some popcorn, and watch while it happens. We call this the virtual 911, a staged hoax, so that Wall Street and Washington, D.C. can duck the blame for the coming crash. and turn it into an attack by our dastardly enemies. That's what this is all about. And we're starting to see that propaganda come out in the European press again about a coming cyber terror attack on the financial system. Terrorists don't need to attack the financial system. It's self-destructing. The Western financial system's doom was sealed the day when they agreed to allow a privately owned central bank to issue the public currency as a loan at interest. On that day, the ultimate fate was set and has been unavoidable. That's what's going on over here. All righty, we're coming up on the top of the hour. Article out of Natural News here. Fraud becoming rampant in scientific research papers, study shows. This gets back to one of the Carbonazzi's favorite arguments, that they have all these scientists lined up who are absolutely convinced the world is getting warmer and only humans are the cause. We'll be back after Phyllis Schlafly and some commercials. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And just looking at my mailbox, the hate mail is still pouring in. Global warming is real. It's all the fault of human beings. Unless you support a carbon tax, we're all going to die. And interspersed between them, I'm getting all the ones, there was no plane at the Pentagon, really, there was absolutely no plane at all. And it's all coming from the same people. It's all coming from the same people. They're pushing the agenda on both of those as hard as they can. And I understand why. We're less than a month away from another anniversary of 9/11, and more evidence, even at this late date, continues to surface regarding the truth of 9/11. Somebody found a Fox video which makes it very clear the reason Flight 93 did not reach New York City was the Air National Guard intervened. The plane was shot down. This whole movie about the heroic passengers deliberately crashing the plane to save more innocent lives in New York is complete nonsense. The wreckage was spread out over 8 miles of countryside. That only happens when the airplane explodes in midair from a missile. I mean, look at how widespread the wreckage from TWA 800 was after it got hit by a missile. When an airplane actually crashes, it's all right there in one little convenient lump. Now, getting back to the story that we had out of Natural News, more and more studies are finding that the influence of politics and money junkies is, in fact, corrupting orthodox science in this country. And apparently, the last year they have records for 2007, retractions for fraud had reached 96 per 1 million, which doesn't sound really significant. Okay, but it basically underscores that just because it's in a science journal and a bunch of scientists say, yes, it's so, doesn't necessarily mean that it's real. Now, a lot of this hate mail I'm getting on the whole global warming thing is saying there's a consensus of scientists that say it's real. And yes, they're all getting funded by Al Gore and various government agencies that are standing to profit from the human-caused global warming hoax. But as Michael Crichton used to say, consensus isn't science, and science isn't consensus. Science is what's really going on. Consensus is a political term, where they try and get you to believe something because they've managed to have a whole bunch of other people stand up and say they believe it. The herd mentality. Like science is a democracy, where if 9 out of 10 scientists say the moon is made of green cheese, we should just accept it. And that, of course, is nonsense. The majority in science is usually actually wrong. With the most obvious example being Galileo, who stood up and said the Earth revolves around the sun at a time when the consensus of scientific opinion was the Earth was the unmoving center of the universe. And in that clear example, the consensus was flat out wrong, because they were subject to influence by the political and financial interests of the day, mainly the church. Before the majority can be right, one person must be right. And while that one person is right, the majority is wrong. Most scientists are playing catch-up with the few genuine innovators, the few genuine scientists with real courage to say, I'm looking at the data and I don't agree with your conclusions. We have what we call the golden rule of science. Whoever's got the gold decides the science. And starting with Al Gore and his push for a carbon trading scheme, which made him very, very rich, funding went to scientists who claimed they could prove humans were causing global warming, and those scientists who stood up and said, wait a minute, the data doesn't show that, they were defunded to silence them. It's that blatant. We documented how the temperature sensors from which these carbonazis were getting their warming data were located next to trash incinerators, in the air conditioning outflow of buildings. Temperature sensors out in rural areas that were recording cooler temperatures were simply shut down, ostensibly for budget reasons. And they relied on temperature sensors inside cities, which tend to be hotter places. Because you know that air conditioning you're sitting in, it doesn't magically make things cooler. It's a heat pump. It takes heat from inside the building where you're sitting, and it dumps it outside the building where those temperature sensors are located. And it's called the urban heat island effect. Cities are naturally generators of heat. And if you're taking all your temperature measurements around those areas, yes, you're going to get warmer numbers. But it doesn't mean the world as a whole is warming up. It means your city is warming up. And again, this is a fraud. All the predictions they were making failed. Greenland still has all of its ice. Snow is not a thing of the past. The polar bears didn't die. The sea levels didn't rise. The Arctic ice caps didn't vanish. But it's still being pushed as a political agenda because the federal government of the United States of America is desperate to find yet another way to take more money from you via a carbon tax. And now we have John Kerry waving the flag that Obama is going to do something about climate without congressional approval. And I'd like to remind this former constitutional law professor, although apparently that claim has now come under serious doubt. The president is not allowed to simply create laws and taxes out of thin air. That's the job of the Congress, subject to constitutional review by the United States Supreme Court. All the president can do is sign the legislation or decide to veto it. That is the limit of the president's power. Obama cannot all of a sudden implement measures to control climate through executive order, because the proper role of the executive order is for the president to execute the will of the Congress. That's why it's called the executive branch. And the executive orders are really only binding on the federal government and its workers themselves, not the American people. Obama could sign an executive order tomorrow saying all Americans have to agree to whistle Dixie in the key of F. And there's absolutely no law that says we have to agree to do so. It's simply not binding. A lot of presidents have abused the executive order. Especially, they'll sign them while Congress is in recess, because the way the rules operate is Congress has 30 days to review any executive order in the Federal Register and veto it. And so a lot of presidents, when they're abusing the executive order, will do so when Congress goes on a recess, knowing they're not going to get back in time to really do anything about it. But under the Constitution, the president cannot craft laws out of thin air. He does not have the authority, and to attempt to do so means he's not acting as the President of the United States of America under the Constitution. He's just a private citizen trying to bluff his way through to more of your money and obedience. Now, speaking of scientific fraud, there's been another embarrassment. This is coming out of science/.org, where apparently an article was published in a chemistry journal that inadvertently included private notes from the editor, which called on the author to, quote, just make up an elemental analysis. And remember, back to that whole ClimateGate scandal, where somebody inside the University of East Anglia leaked a treasure trove of emails among the various ringleaders of the Carbonazi agenda, in which it was clear fraud was being undertaken to support this global warming agenda. Because they all got cranked up about global warming in the late 1990s when the world was in fact getting warmer, and then Mother Nature basically did up at them, and the world started getting cooler. And that's when they started fudging the data, because their funding, their media attention, their political agenda was all tied into selling the world that it was getting warmer when it demonstrably was not. And I remember seeing all these people coming out and saying, well, yeah, it's cooler where you are, but trust us, the rest of the world is just roasting away. And they leaked the computer code showing it was all a monumental fraud. And they're still trying to push it because they are desperate for your carbon tax money. We'll be back with a caller after these words from our sponsor. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're going to grab a phone call here. Kyle in Philadelphia. Aloha, Kyle. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Michael. I wanted to talk about man-made global warming. And a lot of the problem that people have is that in some cases, the data does prove man-made global warming. However, the acquisition of that data is completely fraudulent. And a lot of people don't dare go one level back and look at the fact that some of the thermometers were placed on blacktop in the middle of cities, some were placed by heat exhaust, some of the code and how they gather the data was altered. So it's very confusing to people because they read the 6 o'clock, they see the 6 o'clock news, they read the paper, and they just see the data. They don't question how the data was acquired, and that's the issue we should be pushing is the acquisition of the data, not debating the data.
Well, both ends were fraudulent. The method by which data was being acquired to support the agenda was fraudulent. And even when the data did not support the agenda, they simply outright rigged it. Remember that whole hide the decline that came out of Michael Mann and led to those wonderful videos from Minnesotans for Global Warming? And the reality is these people were funded to come up with the data to support a political agenda. And you should never have politics dictating the science because what you get isn't science, it's just politics wrapped in a white lab coat. And it's complete and utter nonsense. I mean, remember the story of the Tuskegee Airmen and the unit, the senator who was opposing the formation of the unit had a scientific college professor written study that blacks simply could not handle the complex equipment used in then modern fighter aircraft, which of course was complete and total and utter nonsense. But you can always find some academic desperate for tenure, desperate for funding, desperate for a little media attention to go on out there and say whatever you want him to say. And the important lesson of this age for everybody to understand is scientific method is a valuable tool for arriving at the facts of an issue. But individual scientists are no more honorable or trustworthy or free from corruption than politicians or the clergy. Individual scientists have ambitions. They want to be right. And that is why scientific method actually exists. It is a recognition by the science field that individual scientists are flawed, that they can be driven by their desire for riches and fame and patents, or they can be influenced by the people who sign their funding checks. They can be influenced by the desire for media attention. And there was another story we were talking about here about a psychologist did this experiment on a convention of scientists. They hired an actor, Michael Fox, not Michael J. Fox, another Michael Fox, who got up there and just gave this rambling scientific presentation that was full of complete and abject nonsense, and the majority of the scientists in the audience filled out favorable reviews for him on the review cards, the speaker review cards. The scientists go along with the fashion trends just like any teeny bopper down at the malt shop. And I realize I'm giving my age away with that reference.
And the science can't have an agenda. Science has to be the facts and the scientific method and where the information leads you. Global warming science has an agenda, whether it's one way or another. It's attempting to prove something or disprove something, and that's bad science across the board.
Well, in the case of global warming, the agenda was to come up with some concocted hobgoblin to scare people into agreeing to yet another form of taxation and government control over their standard of living. Oh, if you go on living as wastefully as you are now, the earth will die. And it was a complete and absolute fraud. It was driven by the agenda. The funders simply went out and they gave money to anybody who'd go along with the agenda, and they denied funding and publication to anybody who questioned the orthodoxy. And that was one of the things that really damaged the reputation of a lot of these science journals that were involved in all of this, was the idea that properly written, researched, peer-reviewed articles that questioned the orthodoxy of human-caused global warming were simply refused for publication without explanation. The whole thing was all about pushing that agenda of saying the world is warming uncontrollably, it's all the fault of carbon dioxide, and not just all carbon dioxide, but only that less than 1% that humans create. That was the lemon they were trying to sell. And let me finish up one more point here, and then I'll let you talk again, because I'm still engaged in a debate over in the aftermath of that Harry Reid article. Okay? Carbon dioxide was picked as the villain because it could be blamed on human activity, even though human activity contributes less than 1% to global carbon dioxide, the vast majority of which coming from volcanoes like that one we have over there. If they were really concerned about the environment, they would be talking about methane, which is 70 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of its greenhouse effect, and it is pouring up out of the ground right now because of all this fracking that's going on. But we don't want to offend the oil and shale companies, so we're going to demonize carbon dioxide because we can blame that on people and guilt them out of carbon taxes. And you want to know what the worst greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is? By far, it's water vapor. But you try and sell taxation on people for the clouds over their heads, and you're not going to get very far. This was set up as a sales campaign to say the earth is in trouble, it's your fault, and you will atone by giving us your money in obedience. That's the agenda behind the human-caused global warming scam.
Well, and God has given us God or the universe or the earth has given us the defining fact when it comes to carbon dioxide and global warming. And that is in 2010, when that Icelandic volcano went off, and over the course of 10 days, released more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than the entirety of human history. And
that's exactly right. Down
1 point.
Down here on the Big Island, Kilauea has been erupting continuously for decades now, pouring out tons of carbon dioxide. And you know what happens when atmospheric carbon dioxide goes up? Plants grow faster and bigger, which means more food in a world that is already beset by famine. And the plants, as they grow bigger and faster, will suck that excess carbon dioxide out of the air. It is a natural self-correcting system. But Al Gore didn't want to hear that global warming could be dealt with by encouraging people to plant more bushes around their house. In fact, his aide that suggested that got fired, because Al Gore's goal was carbon tax and submission to a global environmental authority. And Al Gore knows nothing about science. I've got him on video saying the temperature of the Earth's core is millions of degrees, and he's off by a few zeros. He's just saying whatever he thinks the American public will listen to, his hockey stick, whatever, in order to turn your carbon tax money over to the government to buy and sell carbon credits that he is going to make a huge amount of money on. And you need to understand something important. Al Gore set up his carbon trading scam assisted by Ken Lay of Enron. And the goal here is to do to planet Earth with carbon dioxide what Enron did to California with electricity. It's just another scam.
Back during the time of the dinosaurs, there was dramatically more CO2 on the Earth, which allowed plants to grow a lot more and a lot bigger. Ergo, there was a lot more food for the plant-eating dinosaurs, so they grew bigger, and the meat-eating dinosaurs ate the larger plant-eating dinosaurs, so they grew bigger, and which is why when there's more CO2, there's more life, there's more larger life, and there's more abundance and diversity of life on this planet.
You're absolutely correct there. If carbon dioxide were to go away, the entire cycle of life on this planet would simply collapse. But you know something? These global warming people have no intentions of doing anything about carbon dioxide other than to wave it at you to guilt you out of carbon taxes. And that is absolutely the truth. And one more thing. I'm going to let you go here, Carl, because we're coming up on a commercial break. Climate is supposed to change. There has never been a moment in the history of Earth when climate wasn't changing. It was changing before humans got here. It'll go on changing after humans are gone. It is the way it is supposed to be. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here and continuing on our science and medicine portion, as it were. A lot of vaccines seem to wind up being tested in foreign countries, often with very negative effects. We were reporting last week about this story coming out of the Himalayan Times that the bird flu epidemic that is erupting across that part of the world has been tracked back to poultry ranches where an unapproved bird flu vaccine was being tried on the poultry. And the implication here is that the vaccine actually triggered the disease, that they're waving around now saying, oh, you've got to get vaccinated for it. Over in Vietnam, they have now canceled the use of the hepatitis B vaccine throughout the entire country after 3 brand new born babies died from system shock after being given that vaccination. I mean, I understand the attraction of vaccines. You're selling medicines to healthy people. It's just like the old traveling Wild West medicine show salesman. Roll the wagon into town, crank the stage down. There's a scourge out there. If you want to be protected, buy this bottle of pepper oil or whatever else they put in there. And they're very reckless with it. And the idea is, we're doing good and that justifies everything, but we're coming to find out that some of the ingredients of those vaccines aren't very good for people. They've been using peanut oil as an adjuvant in vaccines, and it seems to be the cause of this raging epidemic of peanut anaphylaxis in the population. Considerable evidence linking mercury-based preservatives like thimerosal to the explosion of autism in young people after they get the vaccines. Story coming out of naturalnews.com. Remember we were talking the other day about how Merck was now explaining away the fact that Gardasil was actually shriveling up the ovaries of girls that were given the shot, making them permanently sterile by saying, oh, we didn't test for that. It's not our fault. We didn't know. And apparently there's another expose coming out that says that much of the Gardasil safety data that is out there is fraudulent. And you need to read the original article because they go on about the overhyping of omega-3 fatty acids. The corporate media was trying to say fish oil causes cancer because they don't want you going out and taking care of yourself. They want to keep you dependent on big pharmacy and big doctors. It's a lot of fraud here. Another story that's coming out, this is published in the journal Cancer Epidemiology, Biomarkers and Prevention, says that women who are taking statin drugs have an 83 to 143% increased risk of breast cancer. It's not about your health. It's not about your wellness. It's about selling you product. And if that product makes you ill, not a problem. We've got another pill to give you for the side effects. They're treating symptoms and side effects. They don't want to cure diseases. Disease is a revenue opportunity. They don't want it to go away. Nobody's searching for a cure for cancer or a cure for AIDS. They'll tout about it to get funding, but an actual cure for cancer would destroy the cancer industry. A cure for the common cold would destroy all the over-the-counter cold treatment industry. It's all geared to having you buying something from the pharmacy every single month for the rest of your life. If you could take one pill and be cured of a disease, you are no longer of any use to the medical establishment. We have the most expensive medical care in the world, and it's something like 30th in safety and efficacy. Our newborn mortality rate is a scandal for an industrialized nation. Now, a while back, it came out that the polio vaccine being given to Americans between the years 1955 and 1963 were contaminated with a primate form of the cancer virus. Now, that may or may not be an issue, because viruses tend to be species-specific. It's not a guarantee. Viruses can jump species, from pigs to birds to humans. But rather than go back and address this issue, apparently the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention deleted the pages from its website talking about this contaminated polio vaccine. It's been Orwellized. Winston Smith is now working for the U.S. government, erasing online references to these horrible botched accidents. Which brings us back to my favorite theory for the origin of the AIDS virus in the smallpox vaccination campaigns across Africa. Because those vaccines in Africa were not being imported from safe quality labs here in the United States or in Europe. They set up these little grass shack operations in the middle of Africa to take cowpox virus and culture it on sheep's liver. And as it turns out, the cows, along with suffering from cowpox, were suffering from bovine leukemia, and the sheep livers were taken from some sheep that had the sheep visna virus. And it's an absolute perfect situation, environment for spontaneous recombination of those two viruses. And if you look at the physical structure of the AIDS virus, it bears remarkable similarities to bovine leukemia and sheep visna virus. And the explosion of AIDS across Africa being blamed on unprotected sex, which I will agree does not help the situation, but the origin of the illness, as far as I can tell, was a horrible medical accident, just like this one with the polio vaccine contaminated with simian cancer virus. They make mistakes, and the mistakes get sold out there. But they don't want to admit it. This is why CDC is erasing the pages from their website, and why there's a huge hue and cry to say, oh, the AIDS virus came from the green vervet monkey. And there is a problem with that, because remember what I said about viruses being species-specific. When a virus jumps species, in this case from the green vervet monkey to humans, the new virus in the second host can always be made to reinfect the original host. But the human AIDS virus cannot infect the green vervet monkey, which undermines this idea that this monkey was the cause of this virus. Another story coming out of the Daily Sheeple here. Scientists want to weaponize the H7N9 flu virus in a controlled environment. Meaning we hope they won't drop a beaker. Why are they weaponizing these viruses? Biological warfare. That's what they're talking about here. They're talking about biological warfare. And they're playing with live viruses subject to mutation. And you know, there's a very interesting aspect about newly created life forms you need to keep in mind. They mutate dramatically generation to generation. When Ebola first surfaced and was studied, it was mutating as much as 10% of its genome with every generation. Very unstable. Over time, these life forms will stabilize. The genome will become stable, and you see less and less mutation. But if they're tinkering with H7N9 and weaponizing it, they could come up with something that could dramatically change upon deployment and go rapidly out of control here. All righty, we got a caller on the phone, Joe in Maryland. Aloha, Joe. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
I am a product of the SV40.
Okay.
And I want to, it could be a fluke or whatever, but I have had so many classmates. I've been back to Maryland for 11 years, and I have lost so many classmates with cancer. And, we're getting ready to come up on our 50th reunion, and we have really, really lost. In 1 year, we lost 5 of our classmates. In the first year I was home, I couldn't believe we lost so many. And since then, we've lost 4 or 5. Well, a couple of them with heart, but give credit, knowing that it was heart attack. And rest of them, to my knowledge, they were all cancer.
Well, it's rather tragic to see this happening from this very reckless disregard of public safety. And obviously, going back to 1955, it's obvious that Big Pharmaceutical has always had this attitude of let's just sell it out the door, and if there's any side effects, we'll lie about what's causing it. We already know from what we've been seeing more recent times, cancer was blamed on all kinds of things, from tobacco, when it was actually the radioactive fertilizer that tobacco was being grown in. And it's always just this case of cover your rear, protect the profits, and to heck with the people. Joe, I'm sorry to cut you off soon, but we do have another commercial break to get through. I'm sorry to hear about your friends, and I know it is a tragedy how cheap life has become under the United States of America. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. Now, we were talking a while back about American psychiatrist Dr. Leon Eisenberg. And he is the guy who literally invented ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, which when I was a kid, we called it teacher is boring me, so I'm going to look out the window and daydream. And 7 months before he passed away, he actually went public and said ADHD is a prime example of a fictitious disease. In other words, they make these things up out of thin air and then sell you a pill to treat it with. The reality of the psychiatric field is there are no actual scientific tests that you can run on somebody and say this person is crazy or he's suffering from this or that. It's purely subjective. Some practitioner with papers on the wall will say, in my expert opinion, this person is thus and so, like that Army psychiatrist who's out there saying that Bradley Manning is suffering gender identity issues in a hostile environment and therefore he's a kook and you shouldn't listen to him. And for years, the standard diagnostic manual for psychiatry has just grown and grown and grown, and the list of diseases, which are just basically they're taking normal human behavior, claiming it's a disease and offering to sell you a pill for it. Now, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is basically what they're calling the smart kids in a classroom who already know what the teacher is still trying to pound into the heads of the dullards, so their attention's going to wander. And the solution to that isn't to perhaps start focusing more attention on the smart kids, which would be my solution, but to dope them all down to the same zoned out level. Like I said, when I was a kid, we called this teacher is boring me. But we'll make it a disease and we'll sell pills for it. What is the pills they're giving to these kids for ADHD? They're SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And not only is it starting to be understood, they really don't work the way the manufacturers claim they're supposed to work to treat these imaginary fictitious diseases. They are, in fact, causing a great deal of harm. Extreme acts of violence without explanation, suicides in people who are not suicidal, tendency to violence and fighting in otherwise peaceful people. We've got a permanent link at whatreallyhappened.com. If you look down the right menu bar, there's a giant medical capsule there, and it's a resource page because something you need to understand here. As they wave around all these mass shootings at you to justify taking away your guns so that only the Infernal Revenue Service will have AR-15s, what they're not telling you is that better than 90% of the perpetrators of this mass inexplicable gun violence were either on or withdrawing from these prescription medications. And by the way, it's when you're trying to withdraw from them that you can get into the most extreme acts of violence. I remember one story that I saw over at ssristories.com was a kid who was put on this medication at the recommendation of his school, and then he tried to kill himself. And they got to him in time. And when it was all over, they said, why'd you try and kill yourself? And he says, I don't know. It just popped into my head and I went with it and I don't know. But it's all about selling the product. And here we have the guy who actually came up with ADHD shortly before he died, said, it's a fictitious disease. We make this stuff up so we can sell you things to cure you. It's all about the money. And the danger here is, of course, that use of ADHD drugs has increased by 50% in the last 6 years, at least over in England, probably worse here. It's estimated 1 out of every 10 Americans are on these dangerous medications, which means 1 out of every 10 police officers are probably on these medications. There's a good explanation for all this violence against the American people. And it also means 1 out of every 10 people in the federal government, if not more, are on these medications because wrecking the country is a highly stressful occupation. During his first term in office, it was reported that Barack Obama was dealing with depression. Do they have him on these medications? It would certainly explain the quality of his decision-making in recent months. And these drugs are very dangerous because drug emergencies related to ADHD treatment have quadrupled in the last 6 years. If you go and apply for a gun permit, in most states, it actually will ask, are you on prescription antidepressants? They know it's a problem. But they don't want to tell you about it. That you might actually stop buying this medication from their dear friends over at Big Pharma, who are such loyal campaign contributors. And in any way, the agenda is to demonize the guns. Blame the guns, not the pills. And it's a very obvious double standard. When there's a mass bombing, you blame the bomber. When there's a mass shooting, they blame the guns. Interesting little story that hit the news over the weekend here. The retirement of Windows XP will be a boon to hackers. And the gist of the story is that hackers are saving up all the bugs they're finding in Windows XP until it officially expires in April of next year. Then they will go on a rampage of attack on XP machines. Now, my opinion is this is most likely sales propaganda by Microsoft to encourage people to buy the newer, meaning buggier and NSA-infiltrated operating systems. Because when XP is unsupported, most people are going to go off XP anyway. Why would the hackers care? They want a target-rich environment. They're going after the operating systems in the widest possible use, meaning the more current ones. Now, when my XP machine dies, since I'm no longer in the animation and visual effects work area, and everything I do can be done under Linux, I'm going to go to Linux. And if anybody out there knows of a source code distribution for Linux, where I get to compile and inspect the code myself, let me know, because that's the safest way to go here. As I mentioned earlier in the show, Reuters is reporting that corrosion in Unit Number 4 at Fukushima could lead to the collapse of that building. And we only have a few more minutes left, so I'm not going to get into all these individual stories like the wall of ice they're trying to propose to contain all that water. The reason they're continuing to pour all that water into these buildings is there is out-of-control fission and just heat from decay processes in those reactor fuel rods. Those spent fuel rods left to themselves will get hot enough to spontaneously ignite into fire. So they're just pouring water in there, trying to keep it cool. The water is building up. It's overtopped the containment wall. 200 tons, up to 400 tons, depending upon who you're talking to, of highly contaminated water has been going into the Pacific Ocean for the last 2 years. Now, my radiation meter here on Oahu measures airborne contamination, and thankfully we're not seeing much of anything happen right now compared to the weeks right after Fukushima. But if those out-of-control decay processes or fission in the ground reach the point where the rods start bursting into flame, it's going to be a completely different story. There'll be clouds and clouds of highly toxic smoke pouring up into the atmosphere. The government of Japan, TEPCO, the government of the United States, General Electric, who designed and built those reactors, have mishandled this from day one. They've spent 90% of their effort on perception management to convince you that really this is no big deal. Remember when Alan Coulter was out there saying a little radiation is good for you? And very little actually trying to deal with the problem because they don't know how. They've grown up in an age where government is all about public perception management. And we'll just hire some consultant to solve the actual problem if we have money left over. So, anyway, completely out of control, melted cores. Yeah, if they're still pouring water down there, there's something down there very hot. Either decay products or outright fission. And from the sudden surge in isotopes like cesium coming out of the ground, I think they've got a runaway spontaneous fission reaction going on down there. I don't know what they're going to do about it. The time to do something about it has long, long passed. We're just all going to have to live with it. Alrighty, there's the music. It's time for us to get out of here and get something useful done with the rest of the day. We'll be back here tomorrow on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Until then, stay safe, stay well. Please, if you have anything left over after the government and corporations are done with you, go over to Republic Broadcasting and hit that donate button. We rely on you to stay on the air. We don't get big checks from Monsanto. We don't get big checks from shadowy non-governmental organizations. You and you alone will keep Republic Broadcasting alive and strong. Please take a moment to help us out. We'll be back tomorrow. Aloha, America.